Welcome to the Oil Minute, creating unlimited value in the oil patch. Today I'm going to talk about pipelines, Jones Act, Iranian gasoline, and we'll do a quick takeaway of the EIA weekly, which just came out about an hour ago. So let's just get right started. Topic number one, yesterday Enterprise announced that they were canceling the Midland to Echo 4 pipeline. So this was a crude pipeline that was going to carry about 450,000 barrels a day out of the Permian Basin into the Houston refining center. Just a story, but if you step back, this actually kind of demonstrates a remarkable flip in the midstream picture. So, one of the most important things to look at in the midstream picture and for crude price differentials is the balance or imbalance between the supply of crude and the takeaway capacity of a pipeline out of that basin to a refining center. So the difference between those two is ultimately going to drive a lot of the price differential. So the crude price in basin, so WTI Midland versus WTI Houston. Last year we saw WTI Midland blow out against WTI Houston. So that was driven largely because the supply of crude that was coming out of the basin was severely outstripping takeaway capacity. So that's what drove that price differential to blow out. But now we have this new world where we're concerned about supply coming out of the Permian Basin. The oil price is low. COVID is destroying a lot of oil product demand for the time being, and some pipelines have already been built. So now we're in a situation where we're in an overbuild. When you have an overbuild, the midstream companies look at it and say, well, we can't really charge that much on the tariff side because there's a bunch of competition that we're facing from other midstream companies, so they have to lower their rates. So this can affect their business case of pipelines that they're going to build. So what Enterprise actually did was they canceled this pipeline, but it was pretty interesting because they were able to put existing commitments that they would have had on this pipeline onto existing systems. So that's actually a pretty smart move. But the story basically is flipped in a year from massive blowouts because you don't have enough pipes to now you have too many pipes, and it's a big issue. So I'm not really predicting this, but I wouldn't be surprised if more pipelines or coastal crude export projects were either canceled or strategically delayed for further review, which a lot of times is the same thing. So that's an interesting story. So you guys ever wonder why the U.S. Is basically flooded with gasoline, and we export tons of gasoline, but New York City rarely actually imports waterborne gasoline from the U.S. So you can actually think this thing called the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which is commonly known as the Jones Act. So the Jones Act, it requires that goods shipped between a U.S. port to a U.S. port, so just directly from U.S. port to U.S. port, be owned, operated, and built by U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So this was originally intended, again, it was passed in 1920, it was originally intended to protect the U.S. shipping industry. And this is extremely old, 1920, right? But what it does today is that this requirement makes Jones Act tankers from U.S. port to U.S. port, makes them much more expensive than a foreign option because, again, you have to be owned, operated, and built by U.S. Citizens or permanent residents. So you take the example, hey, can we ship gasoline to New York? It's like, well, you can, but the only legal way to do that is to have a Jones Act tanker. So New York looks at this and says, well, that's too expensive for me. I'll just import from Europe. So that's kind of when we refer to the Jones Act, and it's a big hot button issue a lot of times. People are either super pro or super against the Jones Act, but it does preclude a lot of U.S. Petroleum and U.S. petroleum products from making their way on sea to other U.S. ports. Also explains why Texas, has a mammoth amount of crude oil, and the U.S. is now, one of the largest producers of crude oil in the world, but the East Coast refiners largely can't benefit from this. Because they have to source oil from other countries, or they have to pay for an expensive Jones Act tanker. So that's a pretty interesting thing that some people just don't know. Here's a really interesting story. So the U.S. about a month ago, or in late July, I believe, they seized two Iranian tankers full of gasoline, and this was, I don't know all the details of this, but I think a federal judge allowed them to do it under existing U.S. sanctions to seize these tankers. So the U.S. government seized these tankers, and now we're in early September, and now these tankers are actually finally made their way all the way to the U.S. Gulf Coast. I think they're about to hit Texas either today or tomorrow or some point in time. So some of the reports that I'm seeing say that the U.S. government is actually going to auction off this gasoline. Again, it's Iranian gasoline. They're going to auction it off and send the proceeds to U.S. victims of terror, which is really kind of interesting. So Iran indirectly donated 2 gasoline cargoes to support American terror victims, which is pretty considerate. So do your patriotic duty and fill up your car with Iranian gasoline if you live in Corpus Christi. That's just a really interesting story. Anyway, so let's get to the EIA. So the EIA came out with their report a day later because of the Labor Day holiday. Here's a few takeaways. So crude built by about 2 million. So inventories of crude increased by 2 million barrels. So, in and of itself, it's a bearish sign for crude. 81 million barrels higher year on year we are in the U.S. So that's pretty considerable. We have a pretty intense inventory to draw down. But on the product side, there's good and bad news. So the good news on the product side is there was a draw for all three clean products, gasoline, jet, and diesel. The bad news is this is basically only because refineries stopped operating basically on the Gulf Coast. I mean, that's an overstatement, but their crude runs are extremely low. So, of course, inventory was drawing down, but it wasn't because of any uptick in product demand in the U.S. So that's not very good for prices. So year-over-year tracker, gasoline is 3 million barrels above where we were last year. Overbuilt, but that's really not that big relatively because we consume about 8-9 million barrels a day. Jet fuel is 5.6 million barrels below where it was last year. Again, I talked about this a few days ago. There was a lot of reports that jet fuel was the problem. And of course, aviation demand is depressed, but in terms of inventories, jet fuel is not the problem in the U.S. Diesel came down, but it's still 39.6 million barrels above where we were last year. So takeaway, you have crude build, you have product draw only because refineries basically quit this week. Diesel's 39 billion barrels above where it was last year. So all in all, I think that should tell you where prices are going. That's all I had today. I'm Zach Rogers. Thanks for watching the Oil Minute.